The title of the talk is different from the one on the program, but I will explain, because this is a work in progress. It's supposed to be a chapter of my thesis in which I address the bigger project, which is the idea of understanding and unpacking the problem of drawing the limits of thought by analyzing the case of the Tractatus. So this is supposed to be a chapter in which I address the bigger problem in the framework of the Tractatus. Okay. So I take there to be a problem that cuts across history of philosophy, that I call drawing the limits of thought, and I give it this general name to indicate the fact that there are many examples in history of philosophy of theories that go through this problem. For example, the Tractatus or Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So theories that try to answer the question of what we can think, or more generally what we can represent. So theories that try to give the conditions of possibility of representation and incur some similar problems. With thought, drawing the limits of thought, with thought I mean something minimal about our ability of representation, so just representing a content to the mind. So something is thinkable if you can represent a certain content to your, a content is thinkable if you can represent it in your mind. So when a theory tries to give the conditions for something to be thinkable, it seems to incur some problems of this sort. So the statements articulating what these conditions of possibility are seem to cross these limits themselves. They seem to point towards what is unthinkable at the same time. So the guideline question that I use as a background question, and the further question to be answered is, can the limits of thought be drawn properly in general? And I take Wittgenstein's Tractatus to be a significant example of a theory attempting this task, but in the same time incurring in this kind of problem and revealing some challenges and some elements that we should perhaps take into consideration when trying to answer this more general question. Okay, so this problem of stating what it takes for a content to be thinkable, and at the same time these statements going beyond the limit, is exemplified, I think, by 4.12 in the Tractatus. So Wittgenstein says propositions can represent the whole reality, but they cannot represent what they must have in common with reality, the logical form. To be able to represent the logical form, we should have to be able to put ourselves with the propositions outside logic, that is, outside the world. So I think this statement is an example of this problem in which you are pointing towards, you're trying to describe what is thinkable, what it takes for a content to be thinkable, but at the same time, to do that, you have to also point towards what is unthinkable, so what is excluded from this description. So I want to ask what motivates this claim? Why can't the limits of language be properly drawn? Why can't the essence of propositions, namely the logical form, be put into words? And as a starting point, I will be saying, I will take that Wittgenstein is endorsing a certain notion of a limit, which is a limit per se. So he's not interested in drawing the limits from the outside, like, for example, by drawing a border between thinkable contents and unthinkable contents, but he's interested in doing a critique of language from within language. So he's endorsing a conception of limit as a limit per se. And I use a definition from Sullivan to describe that. So a limit per se is something set by, so essentially equivalent to the essential nature or form of what it limits. So this definition is supposed to point to the idea of drawing limits from the inside and doing this critique of language from within language itself. Just as a note, so I said at the beginning, the idea is the task that I'm describing is drawing the limits of thought, but I take the limits of thought and the limits of language in the Tractatus to coincide. So by using the case of the Tractatus, I will be talking about the limits of language, but they say the same thing as the limits of thought. Okay, so Wittgenstein is interested in attempting this task by investigating the essence of language. So I will explain a little bit more what it means to give the essence of language. I will try to unpack Wittgenstein's argument for 4.12, and hopefully this analysis will shed some light on the notion of limit per se. It will single out Wittgenstein's motivations and assumptions, and by judging these assumptions or assessing these assumptions, I will ask whether there are some elements that we need to take into consideration to answer the guideline question. And this comes the difference between the title in the original program. So initially, I went to my supervisor and I said, okay, this is the idea I have for my talk, and I think we should look for the motivations for 4.12 in the status of statements that describe the essential nature of language. These statements are necessary propositions. Necessary propositions of logic for Wittgenstein in the Tractatus are tautological and they lack sense. So I think it's in virtue of this status that 4.12 should be explained. And then my supervisor was very puzzled, and he said, okay, but this gives us a very strange picture of the Tractatus, right? As an example of this general problem in which Wittgenstein embraces the task, okay, I'm going to draw the limits of thought, and then he rejects it by just saying, yeah, but the propositions that do that, the necessary propositions that describe the logical form, lack sense. So I'm just going to dismiss the project now. And this doesn't really give a good explanation of what's going on and doesn't help us in understanding whether there are some independent reasons that we should worry about for answering our general question. Plus, Wittgenstein seems to have a very deflationary notion of necessity, so it seems strange that he puts so much weight on the idea of logical necessity in order to explain what's going on in 4.12. So I decided to take a different route and to look into statements that he gives in response to Russell's paradox, and I think these statements against self-reference give a further motivation to 4.12, a further motivation with respect to what we can say just by saying these statements are necessary truths, and necessary truths are tautological, so that's why he dismisses them. Okay, so as I said, Wittgenstein is interested in drawing the limits of thought or language by drawing limits per se. So he's interested in giving the essence of language. So he's interested in describing what is language. And it seems that this is what Russell is pointing at in the introduction to the Tractatus when he says that Wittgenstein is preoccupied with the question, what relation must one fact, such as a sentence, have to another in order to be capable of being a symbol for that other? So Wittgenstein is concerned with the conditions for accurate symbolism. So we can see the case of the Tractatus as a case in which Wittgenstein is trying to say what all symbols have in common, what is the form of a proposition. So to do that, to say what all propositions have in common and what is common to all these propositions that construe language, he needs to avoid Russell's paradox. So I'm going to say that the best place to look for motivations for 4.12 is in claims against self-reference that Wittgenstein is proposing in order to solve Russell's paradox and pointing to an alternative solution that is not Russell's theory of types. So I choose to put here the property version of Russell's paradox, and pardon me if I am superficial, this is something I'm very unfamiliar with, so I'm trying to make sense of it now. Okay, so so we consider different propositions, different properties. Some properties apply to themselves and other properties don't. The property of being a property applies to itself. The property of being a cat is not itself a cat, so it doesn't apply to itself. And then we consider the property of being a property that doesn't apply to itself, and we ask, does the property of being a property that doesn't apply to itself apply to itself? If it does apply to itself, then it doesn't apply to itself, and if it doesn't apply to itself, then it applies to itself. So the paradox arises. So Wittgenstein thinks that this paradox has to do with a problem with self-reference and self-predication. So he introduces certain claims to block the paradox, and these claims are to the effect that they want to show that self-predication is impossible. So in virtue of some rules of symbolism, what look like cases of self-predication are actually cases of ambiguity in the use of same signs for different symbols. I think two claims need to be unpacked to understand Wittgenstein's position, and I will call them 32 and 33 for brevity. And I will start by 33. So in order to unpack 33, we need to take into consideration three elements. So 33 says a function cannot be its own argument because the functional sign already contains the prototype of its own argument and it cannot contain itself. And then it continues, and in the end it says, and this is how Russell's paradox is solved. So three elements I think we should need to consider. The idea of a function, the distinction between sign and symbol, and the idea of intrinsic combinatorial possibilities. So as I put here in the quote, Wittgenstein conceives of a proposition as a function, so as I think an unsaturated structure with some spaces for expressions, and this function expresses a proposition when you fill these spaces with the appropriate symbol. Or for example, in a function you have some variables, you substitute the variable for the appropriate symbol, and in this way you express a proposition. Then there is a distinction between sign and symbol. So, for example, take the construction ARB, which is just in the quote below this quote. So in ARB, A, R, and B are just signs, what we see on the page. And then this construction is constituted of three expressions or symbols. And the quote says, so an expression is every part of a proposition which characterizes its sense. Expressions are everything that propositions can have in common with one another. So for example, in ARB, there are three expressions. The first expression is constituted by the fact that A bears a binary relation to another individual, that an individual bears a binary relation R to another individual, or that an individual bears a binary relation to B. So in the same way as a proposition expresses its sense by indicating how facts are related in reality, in this way expressions are related to one another, and an expression is constituted by these symbols being related with one another. These symbols are constituted intrinsically by their combinatorial possibilities, so by the way in which they combine with each other. And what symbolizes in a symbol is the fact that it bears a certain relation with the other. So for example, if we have FA, what symbolizes in F is the fact that it stands on the right-hand side of the name position. So when we talk about predicates or names, this is just a way to say that what makes a predicate is that it stays in a certain position and it occupies a certain place, and it bears, in virtue of this, it bears a certain relation with the other symbols, and it's in this way that it symbolizes, in the same way as it, in reality, things stand one next to the other, and this is a fact. In the same way, in propositions, symbols stand next to each other, and in this way they symbolize. Okay, having these elements in mind, we can try to understand 33. So a function cannot be its own argument. This is because the form of a name and the form of a proposition are different. So propositional signs are facts. They identify how things stand next to each other, and they are constituted by the fact that symbols stand next to each other in a certain way. And so they are facts and they cannot be named. So there cannot be a function in which a proposition is its own argument, because the argument place needs to be occupied by a name that can be named, and a proposition cannot be named. The sign already contains the prototype of its own argument, is related to this idea of combinatorial possibilities. So it's already intrinsic in what a symbol is, which kind of symbol it can be combined with. And finally, the inner function and the outer function that are in the central part of quote 33 have different meanings, and this is clear. So the the external f and the internal f occupy two different positions, so they are two different symbols, they are two different expressions. So what looks like a case of self-predication or self-reference is actually just an ambiguity in the use of same sign for different symbols. So self-reference seems to be rejected on the basis that symbols have intrinsic combinatorial possibilities, and in virtue of this, the very rules of symbolism exclude the possibility of self-reference. And in light of this, we can also understand 32. So no proposition can say anything about itself because a propositional sign cannot contain itself. For example, proposition 1 of the Tractatus is long. Proposition 1 seems to name a proposition, but a proposition is a fact, so it cannot be named. So we cannot have propositions that talk about themselves. And this seems to be the motivation behind 4.12. So the logical form cannot be said because statements about it would be saying something about themselves, and this is impossible. So we've seen that there is a general problem, which is the problem of drawing the limits of thought, and that theories that try to do that incur in similar problems by saying what can be thought or what can be said. They seem to point to what is beyond the limit itself. And this is expressed in 4.12. But why is it the case that propositions can represent the whole of reality but they cannot represent the logical form? Because propositions about the logical form would be self-referential, and self-reference is impossible. So a question that stays in the background and that will need to be addressed is self-reference really that much of a problem? Are really all self-referential propositions problematic, as Russell's paradox seems to suggest? Both Russell and Wittgenstein thought so. So much that Russell proposes the theory of type as a solution to this idea, right? So he proposes, very roughly, that there are different kinds of linguistic objects that form a hierarchy, and one can refer to all objects for which a condition holds only if they are of the same type. And he seems to suggest a similar strategy to Wittgenstein as well in the introduction to the Tractatus. So he basically says you should give up the idea of generally describing the essence of language. You should just imagine a hierarchy of meta-languages, and from the higher level language, you can always describe the language that is below. And potentially, he says, this hierarchy of languages has no limit. So there is no reason why you should think that there is a way in which to describe language per se. Generally, you just go up one level and you're always able to talk about the language below, and in this way you never have the problem of self-reference. But this view really goes against Wittgenstein's notion of logic as an all-encompassing dimension. So logic fills the world, he says in the Tractatus. So this idea of logic being the only realm of observation that we have, and we cannot go outside of it, with all the consequences of it. So there is no illogical thought, we cannot say anything illogical. So he would be giving up his idea of generality and his idea of logic as an all-encompassing thing if he decided to go in Russell's direction. So I think he has a way out. So he has, in 4.12, he's saying we cannot directly say the essence of language, so we cannot directly draw the limits of thought or language, but we have an indirect way. And this indirect way is the idea of the propositional variable. So, 2 steps to explain this method very quickly. So, the first element, we have seen that a propositional function is a structure with some element spaces. All the symbols that fill these spaces are general. They are general forms of symbols. They are in common with all the propositions. So we can substitute them with variables. And by substituting parts of the propositional function with variables, we obtain a propositional variable. This propositional variable does the work. So it indirectly tells us what the form of the proposition is without the necessity of having statements like all propositions are, either true or false, or all propositions are pictures of states of affairs, which would incur in Russell's paradox. So the propositional variable, by ranging over other propositions, it already identifies classes of propositions. For example, if we substitute a name with a variable, then this propositional variable already identifies the classes of propositions that are the result of all the values we give to this variable. So, in conclusion, Wittgenstein proposes to solve Russell's paradox by excluding self-referential propositions. At the same time, however, he gives a way out. So it's not that in the Tractatus we have this picture of someone attempting the task of drawing the limits of thought or language and then dismissing it. He is proposing an indirect way out, an indirect alternative, and an alternative to the theory of type that preserves the generality of logic and the idea of there being an essence of language as a whole. This method is a substitution process in which variables give indirectly the form of propositions. Okay, so I will conclude by asking some questions and proposing some possible directions. So the main question we need to ask, which I already pointed before, so is self-reference really that much of a problem? And are there independent reasons to motivate Wittgenstein's argument against self-predications, against propositions being about themselves, also his arguments about this force of rules of symbolisms that make self-predication impossible? If these arguments are independently motivated, then perhaps we have reasons to be worried about the possibility of answering to my main question, so can the limits of thought be drawn properly? Maybe we have to answer no, because Wittgenstein gave us some reason. Or if these arguments are not that obvious, perhaps we can argue against Wittgenstein's view and propose a direct method to draw the limits of thought or language. However, I think certainly there are two directions of potential development of this Wittgensteinian case. So first, perhaps there could be a way of having a theory of logic that does without the theory of type and that preserves the idea of an essence of language and the idea of generality of logic. So taking up Wittgenstein's method, we don't have to recur to a meta-language and give up the generality of logic, but we can perhaps follow his direction. And the second direction is something that I think Adrian Moore is Adrian's Moore idea, so the idea that drawing the limits of thought could be something that gives as a result a practical kind of knowledge. So we know what language is, so we articulate the essence of language by knowing how language works. So as a kind of knowledge how instead of knowledge that. And this might be perhaps what Wittgenstein is pointing at when he says the determination of the values is the variable. So it's the process that we learn by mastering how language works that tell us something about what language is. Okay, that's